Hi, everyone. Good morning, James, and good afternoon in Italy. I'm Beatrice Gallelli, China Fellow at the Istituto Affari Internazionali, International Affairs Institute, IAI, working in the Global Lecture Program. And I'm also Assistant Professor at Ca' Foscari University in Venice. I'm extremely happy and honored to have here with me James Millward. Hi, Jim. Thank you for being here. James Millward is Professor of Intersocietal History of Georgetown University, teaching Chinese, Central Asian, and World History. His expertise includes Qing Empire, the Silk Road, Eurasia lutes and music in history, and historical and contemporary Xinjiang, the northwestern region, which nowadays is at the center of international debate for the state repression against non-Han population. His Eurasia Crossroads, a history of Xinjiang, is a must for all those who want to understand Xinjiang history and contemporary reality. I warmly suggest you reading it. James has written extensively on what is going on in Xinjiang, both in journal articles as well as in open ads that have appeared on major news outlets. As many of you already know, the northwestern region of Xinjiang has become the theater of violent repression by Chinese authorities against the non-Han people living in the region. Authoritative scholars, sorry for the lapses, authoritative scholars and media have reported on various ways in which this repression takes place, including internment camp, forced sterilization, to mention just a few. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights released a report defining what is going on in Xinjiang as a serious human rights violations. In today's interview, we will try to go deeper, to dig deeper into the Xinjiang issue. And this is the third in a series of 4 discussions with the leading experts in the field of Chinese studies, China's history, and China's political communication and public diplomacy. The interviews are part of a 1-year project titled Countering Chinese Disinformation in Italy, carried out by IAI. And the aim of this project is specifically to shed light on the contents of China's political communication on a number of key and crucial issues. We started with Una Berzina-Cherenkova, with whom we discussed China-Russia relations, especially against the backdrop of the still, unfortunately, ongoing war in Ukraine. And then we hosted Marina Rudiak, who explained us the current status of the China-led Belt and Road Initiative. And today we will dig deeper on modern and contemporary history, thanks to James Millward. And before talking specifically about Xinjiang and the state violence in the region, I'd like to take a step back because, James, you first and foremost, you are a historian. And the history, or better, its representation, plays a key role in the way in which the central state of the PRC claims control and dominance over the border regions and contested territories. Historical narratives have been crucial in the promotion of the Belt and Road Initiative since the very beginning in 2013. So Xi Jinping geopolitical and this geoeconomic strategy has been dubbed as the new Silk Road, an expression that evokes somewhat romantic idea of an ancient, of an old Silk Route cutting across Eurasia. And let me just very briefly mention the title of another of your books, The Silk Road. A very short introduction is very informative and insightful. So my first question is, do you see any Chinese characteristics in the way in which history is utilized by the political elite compared to other nations? Because of course, the idea of a shared history is at the core of every nation building process. But do you see anything peculiar to China What roles foreign scholars like us, for instance, have played in shaping such a representation of Chinese history? Thank you, Jim, again for being here today.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really pleased to join this podcast and interview series that you're doing. So it's a really good question that you ask about history and the role of historical narratives. I think actually our sense of China's history and the narrative, the historiography, as we would call it, in many ways, it's not a Chinese version versus a Western version. It's kind of a joint venture in a way. In particular, in certain aspects of the story that tend to confuse or even hide what's been going on in Xinjiang and in Tibet. And by this, I mean an exceptionalist way we talk about the Chinese past that's really different from how we talk about most other places. China, of course, is often said to be the oldest civilization in the world, or one of the oldest civilizations in the world, or one of the oldest, sometimes it slips and we say one of the oldest countries in the world or states in the world. And it's that slip from being a cultural entity, a civilization, to this argument that it's a continuous political state that is really important to how we think about Xinjiang and how we think about Tibet, right? Because one of the characteristics of how nationalist Chinese states, so beginning the 20th century, but particularly now the People's Republic of China, how they talk about issues such as Xinjiang, Tibet, and Taiwan, one of the first things that will come up in any discussion is Xinjiang has been part of China for millennia, since ancient times. Tibet has been part of China for a very long time. And even Taiwan, they often imply, try and find the earliest possible moments when it's related to or part of China, even though Taiwan was never part of China before the 17th century when it was conquered by the Qing Empire. So Xinjiang was conquered by the Qing Empire in the 18th century, but there were moments way back in the first millennium BC and in the first and second centuries AD when the Han Empire, which was based in China, had military outposts out there and military relations. And then moments a few centuries later when the Tang Empire had military control and was fighting for control over what is now Xinjiang. So what the Chinese argument relies on, and this is a common response if people say there are human rights violations in Xinjiang, the Chinese government releases a white paper saying, Xinjiang has been part of China since the Han Dynasty, right? It's an interesting answer to the question because it's a non sequitur, right? But they always make that same non sequitur answer. And so they're very concerned about historical longevity and the idea of continuity from those times as a justification, they're saying, for what's going on. Now, of course, from the point of view of human rights, it's no justification whatsoever. But also from the point of history, it's sort of dubious because it depends on a particular way of talking about Chinese history, which we don't really use for other places. I don't think we would claim, for example, that because the Roman Empire controlled the southern part of Britain as it is today, that London is part of Italy, right? Or Ethiopia, even for that matter, right? Things like that. So, but we do this for China, or at least the standard narrative. And I say it's a joint venture because, to a great degree, even Western historians fall into this, and our textbooks reflect it, and television documentaries reflect it. And there's a few, we don't really have time to go into all of this because it's a very sort of complicated way in which this narrative is constructed. But there's a few things which probably listeners will have heard of, which work to help bolster, to help support this exceptionalist, this peculiar way we talk about China. One is this idea of peaceful Sinicization, or becoming Chinese. And so according to that idea, from its core territories thousands of years ago, cultural China has expanded peacefully by assimilating, by Sinicizing its neighbors. and sort of brought them in. So China expanded peacefully, unlike other places which expanded by imperial force, right? That's one of the stories we tell ourselves. Another one for international relations is that international relations in the East Asian system have been more or less peacefully maintained for a long time through something we call the tributary system, at which China is the center of a hierarchically arranged system of states that peacefully trade with each other and share Confucian values. And that idea is also very much part of the image of the Belt and Road. Not explicitly stated, right? But you can kind of see that in, Belt and Road is not an alliance or a union of states like the European Union, right? It's a series of bilateral relationships with China at the center, like the hub of a bicycle wheel, and then a bunch of relationships with these other states. And that's how the Belt and Road is being designed too. There's a lot more, private enterprise and so on is also involved in that. But so it is that kind of center hub and spoke model, not a universal network kind of thing. And that, goes back to this tributary system model. And then I'd say, thirdly, this idea of continuity that we have, the way we can talk about China as always being China, even though we had the Han Dynasty and then multiple other dynasties, a period of many different states comparable to after the fall of Rome in Europe, and then the Tang Dynasty, and then, all the way through the last imperial period. All of these different states, all of which came to power after vicious battles and wars with their predecessors. But somehow all of them are considered to be the same thing, right? It's the same bottle, we just keep putting new wine in, but it's always China, right? So how can we do that? How can we talk about it that way? Obviously, there is cultural continuity, but the way in which we have this impression of political continuity is because we don't talk about Chinese states or countries in geographical China, but we talk about dynasties. China has dynasties. Other places in the world, when we use the word dynasty, we mean a family, right?
Yeah.
When we use this word dynasty with regard to China, we don't mean the Aisenjioro family that ruled the Qing. We don't mean the Li family that ruled the Tang. We mean the state itself, the Tang, the Qing. And so these things cycle in and out, you keep pouring new wine in the old bottle, but the bottle is always the same. So that gives us a sense of continuity, and it's that argument and Sinicization, I think, that allows modern nationalist Chinese states and governments to make the claim that Xinjiang has always been part of something called China, because there has always been something called China, right? Whereas I like to think of China more like we use the word Europe, right? It's a geographical place, definitely has enduring cultural characteristics, obviously changing over time, but there is a continuity there culturally, but lots of different states. And you can't point to the geographical arrangements or the sovereignty of a state a millennium ago and say that that has any bearing on the boundaries today between Italy and its neighbors or something like that, right? So those are sort of three ways in which we think about China that is exceptionalist like this, and lead to us confusing what's going on in Xinjiang and what's going on in Tibet.
Thank you very much. And you also use the word Sinicization, which is also a key word in contemporary China's official narrative on Xinjiang, the Sinicization of religion, for instance, and we will talk about more later on. And now let's try to understand whether under Xi Jinping there's something new What you just described is something which has gone on over the decades, basically since the founding of the PRC mostly. But is history now playing an even more important role in legitimizing the CCP's rule than compared to the previous generation of Chinese leaders? And what are, if it is so, what are the implications for ethnic policies in China? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't say there's a complete departure under Xi Jinping from earlier practices. As I said before, this sense of deep history being tied to China's nationalism, that's been there. But what Xi Jinping has done is amplified certain aspects of it, and he's certainly made it part of his core ideological statements, right? So the idea of the China dream, that has been one of his things. I mean, it's based on a kind of notion of Chineseness, and it's based on a notion of historical greatness for the Chinese people and for Chinese empires or Chinese states, that under the Chinese Communist Party, and in particular under Xi Jinping, this greatness will be achieved again. That's kind of the argument there, right? So pointing back to past episodes of glory and saying, I'm going to get you back to that, right? So rejuvenation of the Chinese people is his term, making it young again. And one thing that's interesting there is, in the first decades of the People's Republic of China, after the Communist Party came to power, the Communist Party was a internationalist socialist party. They embraced Marxist ideas, and they blamed the past, or they looked at the bad things in the past. There were two of them, the way they used to talk about it. There was the semi-colonialism of the imperialists imposing treaty ports, and for example, and the Opium War and all of that. And then there was feudalism, and Mao Zedong famously talked that China was a feudal and a semi-colonial country before the revolution. Now they're downplaying the feudalism part. And when they said feudalism, they never really meant like European feudalism and so on. They meant, bad old society, so on. So under Xi Jinping, there's a relative de-emphasis on bad old society, and rather lots of claims of 5,000 years of excellent civilization until the 19th century, when Western forces came and messed it all up, right? For 100 years of humiliation. And then after that 100 years were over, the Chinese Communist Party came to power and began to put things right again. And so that's the general arc that he's used in downplaying Marxist ways of talking about the past and bringing in a much more Chinese nationalist way in which everything was excellent up until the 19th century. And then another historical symbol that Xi Jinping has liked to use very much is, of course, that of the Silk Road. And as you mentioned before, the Belt and Road has many Silk Road aspects to it. And I think this is actually a brilliant bit of marketing, a brilliant bit of ideology. Of course, it's not Xi Jinping himself who thought it up. He has some very prominent, or quiet, but very successful ideologues who work with him in crafting his speeches. But Silk Road is interesting because it works in two ways. When you're addressing an international audience and talking about the world, the Silk Road is an image, or the image that we generally have of the Silk Road obviously is of trade between China and Italy in ancient times. But more than that, it's become almost a symbol of a golden age of commerce, right? In the myth of the Silk Road, merchants move back and forth across Eurasia. They exchange ideas, they exchange goods, religions, and other things. And we don't really talk about political power or empires or government control. And it's even been used by advocates of neoliberal economics and globalization to say this was the first moment of globalization. Wasn't it great? All of these wonderful things happened as we traded ideas back and forth across the continent. And so externally, the Silk Road idea and this sort of historical model works very, very well for the win-win argument that Xi Jinping is making with the Belt and Road. right? Commerce helps everyone equally. Let's all do this. Let's improve communications. Let's improve trade flows, et cetera, et cetera. So, not surprisingly, back before things got bad, Xi Jinping appeared at the Davos conference, and he sounded like, a neoliberal, sort of a Washington economist or something like that in the Hayek school, right? Because he was making all those claims. So the Silk Road idea works for that. But domestically in China, it has a very different resonance. It has all of that as well. But in addition to that, what do people in China think about with the Silk Road? They think about moments of past imperial greatness. The Han Empire, when China was very, very large and when it extended all the way out into Central Asia. The Tang Empire, same thing. And it was a period there, the way they talk about it there is when all the world was coming to China's door, right? Because China was the center of the world historically. So Buddhism was coming to China, and traders such as Marco Polo were coming to China to come and trade. And China can say, yes, and that's when we gave pasta to the Italians. They learned about noodles from China, right? So domestically, then, it works as a very nationalistic signal. It talks about past eras of greatness. So that's why I think it's an excellent way of branding this program. And the BRI really is more about branding than anything else. It's not a master plan with a blueprint somewhere in Beijing. It's a way of talking about a lot of things that are going on. Yeah,
it's a label put on already existing projects in most of the time, actually. Thank you very much. It is extremely interesting the way in which the Belt and Road Initiative is aimed to boost globalization abroad and nationalistic sentiment within China. But let's now move to the dire situation in Xinjiang. Because in a recent published op-ed on Foreign Affairs, you denounced the fact that the reaction by the international community, including the US, was too little and too late. What are, in your view, the main cause for this? Do you think that Islamophobic sentiments, which have become, unfortunately, quite widespread since the global war on terror was launched in 2000s, play any role? What do you think?
Yeah, so I didn't denounce, or I didn't intend to entirely denounce the reaction as too little. And I'm not sure about whether it's too little. Definitely the sanctions, and we can talk more about these later, but sanctions are having an effect, but frankly, it's very, very difficult to move a state the size of People's Republic of China, through these kinds of economic sanctions. So that's a broader issue. But it was slow. They were slow to come about, as I did indeed write in that article. And I think there were several reasons for that. Some of that was simply the politics of the Trump administration, and a kind of mixed view about China, and really a transition in the United States Republican Party from its traditional position of being pro-business to a position where it actually doesn't care so much about business anymore and seems to be much more ideological. And so what would have really been the business community would have been pulling the brakes against sanctioning China for anything. That was beginning to have less and less effect under the Trump administration. But nonetheless, it was there at the beginning. Particularly in the person of the Secretary of Treasury, Steve Mnuchin. But the rest of your question is quite interesting. To what extent did Islamophobia play a role in this? And definitely Islamophobia, the so-called global war on terror, which was really the main rubric of American foreign policy from 9/11 through into the 2010s, really through the Obama administration. That has definitely influenced the situation in Xinjiang. Even before 2001, there was, of course, a lot of suspicion and concern that any unrest or any dissent in Xinjiang, where the non-Chinese peoples are culturally Muslim, at least, and many are, of course, practicing Muslims, the Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and others. There's a lot of sense that, okay, well, Muslims, whenever they're under any kind of stress anywhere, or maybe in Islamophobic thinking, just Muslims cause trouble, right? Certainly in certain circles in the United States, there are those who felt that. And so I think it was very, very slow for attention, very, very slow for recognition of what was going on, and certainly for sympathy with the Uyghurs to sort of break through into public awareness. And even in the media, for many, many years, this was something that used to drive me crazy. The only stories about Xinjiang, the only time they would talk about it, they would have to be talking about terrorism. Even if they were broadly sympathetic or talking about Chinese oppression, there would always have to be a paragraph about terrorism in the region, using that word. So after 9/11, then, even more so, the US created this framework which China could use to explain, to define its issue in Xinjiang, define its problems there. And of course, they used this formula of the three evils of extremism, terrorism, and separatism, linking all of those things together as an explanation, right? And it's interesting to kind of pause and think about that for a minute, because it's constantly repeated. Even if you take at face value that all of those things were there and that there was a serious terrorist threat, and that threat was exaggerated. But even if you take that at face value, would we put separatism in the same category as terrorism, right? Sort of, Catalan separatism in Spain, or French separatism, in Quebec, right? We have ways of dealing with our Scottish separatism in the UK. There are separatisms all over the place. They do not necessarily equate to
terrorism,
terrorist acts, random killing of civilians in order to make a political point, right? But China casts them all together, which tells you something about how seriously they view any kind of territorial threat and how sensitive and hypersensitive they are to expression of non-Chinese or expression of diverse cultural identities, right, across China. Definitely that was, it played a role, and it really took good 10, 15 years, I think, for media and for governments to kind of see beyond that specter of terrorism. And of course, there were a small number in 2013, 2015, there were actually some real terrorist acts, relatively small, but they, alarmed authorities in Xinjiang, and they were reported widely internationally. What was less well reported was an ongoing, continuous, and often quite violent dissent within the region, particularly the southern part, but not what most people would see as terrorism. So this was, for example, altercations with police, very excessive policing, police removing veils from women, police going into people's houses. And in the course of this, altercations happen, people would be killed like this. Or farmers upset about an environmental issue or loss of their pension funds or family planning rules, marching on local police stations in a small town in southern Xinjiang. Things like that, always reported as terrorist acts in the Chinese press, impossible to verify internationally. But even some of the ways they're reported in the Chinese press were interesting. They would say, 300 terrorists attacked a police station, right? Or there was a fight, and 75 terrorists were killed, and 2 police, right? Things like that. So the numbers don't really fit with our image of terrorism. And one of the problems with the global war on terror framework being out there was that it allowed it gave you an impression that unrest in Xinjiang was related, had an international component, was related to international movements, was maybe even sponsored or organized outside of China. And there's actually very, very little evidence for all of that, for any of that. Almost everything that has been going on, be it general unrest, sometimes violent, or those relatively few terrorist acts, seem to be locally planned, small scale. There isn't a large organization about that. So one of the things that's happened more recently, really, since 2017, is that the policies of Xi Jinping are really so clearly indiscriminate and so clearly excessive. 1 to 2 million people being interned, and even more being, and another several 100,000 being imprisoned. Efforts to repress the Turkic language itself, separating children from their parents, bulldozing shrines, attacks on cultural heritage. None of these things have any relationship to terrorism, right? To counter-terrorist acts. Certainly not of those numbers, right? And so it's really kind of stripped away this veil that this is about terrorism, and the Chinese, that there needs to be a firm hand because there's a terrorist threat in Xinjiang. It's so excessive that no one really believes that anymore. And to their credit, the media now have stopped seeing every Xinjiang story, every story about Uyghurs has to mention terrorism, and it's been that way for several years now, because it's clearly something else going on. And I would say what else is going on is that we have resistance to rule by outsiders. We have resistance to what political scientists would call heteronymous rule. In other words, not autonomous, not self-rule, but rule by another. And that's what we're seeing. And particularly, there's a strong cultural and assimilative component to that, where the Chinese state now is trying to re-engineer the ethnicity of Uyghur and other non-Han peoples there. Their language, the criticism of religion, repression of religion very much. All of those sorts of things, which clearly are not related to trying to catch and interdict militant bands or terrorist bands. They're much more broadly aimed at a culture entirely. And so we're seeing much less discussion of that now, except of course from Chinese sources, which still try to bring that up. But even there, it's actually quite telling. There's much less discussion and much less sort of mention of terrorism having been the reason for all of this. And now they talk about poverty, about people need jobs. So now the main explanation is that, we need to alleviate poverty in the region and to develop the region. Therefore, we've put all of these people in vocational schools, and therefore we're moving them all into factories in order to do that. Right. So they're connected, but they're not sounding that note so much anymore because it doesn't work. The global war on terror is no longer the flashing neon light of American foreign policy, and so they've finally stopped referencing it so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, because this assimilative component, like it is the other side of the discursive coin of the great China, of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, of course, because the Chinese culture should absorb all the different cultures that live in the territory of the PRC.
Yeah, if I can just interrupt for a second, that's a really important point. I mean, and China is a very diverse place. It has been a very diverse place. The system of autonomous regions and autonomous counties and so on that the PRC put in place in the 1950s, the celebration, or what used to be the celebration of 56 different peoples of China, the Han and 55 others whom they call minorities. But that was very much part of the makeup of the People's Republic of China. It was a kind of top-down socialist diversity, right? And that's what Xi Jinping, only in the last few years, has been moving so radically away from. And we remember the idea of one country, two systems, Hong Kong as a special autonomous region, the offer to Taiwan that was on the table that Taiwan could come back to, or in the way the PRC puts it, return, but could join, could unify with the PRC, but they would have their own system, right? So all of these are pluralist notions. They're not democratic pluralism, but they're a kind of top-down pluralism, which are very much part of the DNA of the People's Republic of China. And one by one, we've seen Xi Jinping moving away from all of those, ethno-national diversity, and also even these, political diversity systems, for example, that Hong Kong enjoyed up until this national security law.
Thank you very much. I hope we will have another opportunity to discuss more about these topics. But let's move on to the last question, because the time runs fast. So my last question has to do with the definition of human rights. Because the state violence in Xinjiang has been defined, as I mentioned before, as a serious human rights violation. But the Chinese government replies by providing their own definition of human rights, where there is a prominence of the rights to socioeconomic development, as you just mentioned, the idea of poverty alleviation of the state that is applying those measures and policies to eradicate poverty, basically, in Xinjiang. And of course, socioeconomic development are considered more important than compared to civic and political rights. At the same time, the discourse on human rights has been instrumentalized, so to speak, in the past by democratic countries. So in your opinion, how can we avoid the sort of whataboutism when facing the crisis on Xinjiang without falling prey of the current propaganda war?
Well, it's certainly very much part of the Chinese approach in its international propaganda to try to redefine human rights and to make this point. And particularly in the UN, where China now has a lot of influence, they've actually been using that to try to rewrite key documents and redefine human rights to focus on these economic aspects. Now, in the process, they're also blurring them and making them vague and making them impossible to really nail down. And I think that's the real goal here. But I certainly don't disagree, actually, that there should be a socioeconomic component to human rights. I think the United States, for example, should have universal health care, right? So should the PRC, for that matter. I think that inequality that we now see, it's very high in the United States. It's quite high in China too. So I just looked up the Gini index, the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality. And so for the United States, the most recent number is 41.5, and this is something where a high number is bad. So the US is quite unequal. The PRC is at 38.2 though, so not that far behind the US. Italy is at 35.2, but for developed countries, if you want to look for a relatively low inequality index, we have to look to Scandinavia, of course. So Iceland's 26, Scandinavia's 27. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. So US and China are actually up there with inequality. So I think both US and China need to do more about that. Now, when the People's Republic of China, though, brings up this economic component, they're really presenting a false trade-off, right? Because you don't need to sacrifice freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of movement, and you don't need to lock up millions of people, suppress diversity, repress their language. You don't need to do any of those things to pursue economic development, right? One of the problems in Xinjiang is that China talks a lot about pursuing economic development, but it hasn't really been using what are now best practices of the international development community for rural development in poverty-stricken places, right? There's been many mistakes made over the last several decades in trying to develop places through big projects. Let's build a huge dam, or let's just go in and tell people what they need to do, and you have to stop being farmers, you need to all be factory workers, and those kinds of top-down programs have been proven again and again to be less effective than bottom-up programs, and programs that actually get input from local people about what they need, or then programs programs that actually use microfinancing, small loans, often given to women in rural communities, so they can start a small business, or they can get another cow, or use their cell phone to communicate in certain ways, right? So what China talks a lot about trying to alleviate poverty in southern Xinjiang, and has spent billions and billions and billions on this highly securitized top-down approach. But what it has not done is actually tried what is now considered best practices of human development using bottom-up strategies. And the great irony here is that one of the foremost, most impressive examples of development in the world over the past half century or more is in fact China itself, right? The standards of living, the per capita incomes of people, and particularly even the peasants, or even farmers, have been raised phenomenally in many parts of China since the 1980s, right? Now, how was that affected? How did they do that? The clear story that everyone has been following has been they did that by opening up, by giving the peasantry access to markets, allowing them to decide what crops to grow and what to grow, allowing for small businesses to start, and so getting out of the way of entrepreneurship on the part of individual people like this, right? So that this wonderful method, which works so well in places like Sichuan or Hunan or other parts of eastern China, in the Han areas of China, that is the one thing they have not done in Xinjiang. In rural communities in southern Xinjiang, it has remained strongly controlled. It has remained under the structures like the old communes from the 1960s and 70s and 50s and 60s and 70s, where a farmer has to pay the commune administration for their fertilizer, for their seed, for their equipment. And then when they grow their crop, they have to sell their crop to the commune for the price that the commune determines, right? So they're still caught in a company town kind of situation, and they haven't been given the freedoms that other parts of China have. So a different approach to development would really work, I think, and they should try that in Xinjiang, getting away from these top-down approaches.
Thank you very much, Jim. It has been a really insightful interview. Thank you very much. Before we say goodbye, a very quick reminder. All the interviews, including this one with James Millward, are available on the webpage of IAI. And I'm also glad to announce that we will have James, Marina, and Una in Italy soon for 2 events, one public conference, which will take place on the 9th of March, and a workshop in Venice the following day. So I'm looking forward to meeting you, James, and thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to Italy very much myself. See you there.
Thank you.